All right. So what we're going to cover today is name and gender marker changes. Now, the thing is with name and gender markers is it's hyper-specific county by county. So there's a lot of information. There's some questions we won't be able to answer because they are so hyper-specific, but we'll give you ample chances to write down our email and then we can answer those like more specific questions via email, maybe not today during the webinar. But first, we're just going to go over some basic housekeeping things similar to what we just went over. We're going to talk a little bit about what our organization is. So Advocates for Trans Equality is a brand new organization. We were officially merged in 2024. So you might have heard of National Center for Trans Equality, or NCTE, before, or you might have heard of Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, TILDEF. Both of those are very long names. But yeah, we as two different orgs merged together to create one. And now with us joining together, between the two of us, two orgs, we have about 40 years of experience doing frontline advocacy work. So we have an impact litigation team. Now we have an organizing team. We have policy, trans health project, our name change project, all different types of programs that we now offer, which is super exciting. Tina and I both work on the name change project. So our name change project is currently closed while we resolve some of our technical hiccups from the merger, as well as onboard some new staff. But when we are open, we can directly help people in the counties listed on the slide above. So Atlanta, Chicago, parts of New Jersey, the 5 boroughs in New York City, Long Island, Philly, and Pittsburgh. So if you're in any of those areas, when we're open, we can offer pro bono representation or free representation with an attorney if you meet some of our income requirements as well. If you're outside of those areas and you just have like general questions or concerns, you can always hit us up at our name change email, which I'll drop in the chat once I'm done. And that way we can answer, like I said, more generic questions for people who are outside of our service areas, because we also have a pretty detailed list of resources and other programs like ours for doing this work. We're not super unique. There are tons of name change projects throughout the country. So if you don't live in our service area, let us know. We might be able to find someone that could help you. Some of our other work is our impact litigation team, which they do some really exciting stuff. They work on actually filing cases, filing amicus briefs. So that's a friend of the court brief all across the federal courts in the country on behalf of trans and non-binary people. One case we had was down in Miami-Dade County. Some people who are trans or non-binary were arrested for protesting for Black Lives Matter, and they were like housed and searched in the incorrect facilities, and we ended up winning that case and seeing the county implement some change. So that was really exciting. We also have our trans health project. So they work in two ways, which I think is really cool. So they're helping with templates for denials for surgery and things like that. But then they're also working on like systemic larger issues, like taking on, I believe it's a transit workers union, and making sure they were covered in our healthcare with trans healthcare. And so those projects came from TILDEF. But then we also, when we merged with CTE, we also gained an organizing department. So they work directly with transgender people and allies to take direct action for trans people, working with, on anti-trans bills, lobbying with our elected officials, things like that. And then we also have a policy team who's working with the folks in DC and actually meeting with the people in our government to advocate for trans people. So it really makes sense that our two organizations have combined because, the law and policy, they all kind of like connect into each other. So it really is cool that we joined together and sort of like doubled our team size, which is really exciting. Enough about who we are. I'm speaking to probably a room full of people who know a lot of these terms on the slide, but we just like to cover them because we know not everyone uses the language in the same way. So Tina and I are going to use the word transgender as an umbrella term, knowing that, not all non-binary people identify under the transgender umbrella. That's just how we use it today. If you are a trans person or aren't a trans person, it's always good to clarify language with people if you're helping them through the name change process, just to make sure that you're all on the same page about what terminology you're using. Even if you're trans, it's good to check in with your friends because things change, people update language all the time. Another thing, Tina and I are not making legal recommendations, and that's really important. So this is not legal advice, and this webinar doesn't create any sort of attorney-client privilege. And part of that is Tina and I are not attorneys. We've just been doing this work for a really, really long time. Together, we've been a part of over, I think it's 3,000 name changes at this point across all of our service areas. So we're just showing like what information we've gained along the way from doing this work. Again, it's not legal advice. So now we're going to actually get started on how to do your name change and sort of the basics of like getting started. Again, it's super specific county by county, so I won't be able to give you the exact protocol for your county, but what we can do is give you sort of an overview of the process and start to give you some of the terms you might see. So when you go to do your own research for your exact county, you'll be more equipped to understand the language. So the first thing you want to do is make a to-do list, whether you're a physical, like write it down with a pen and paper, or you want to make a note in your phone. Start that now while Tina and I are doing this presentation, because anytime on a slide that we mention something that might be relevant to you, like maybe some legal or personal history that is required for part of this process, make a note that you need to find the documentation for that. And we'll go over each one of those kind of buckets as we go through the presentation. So give a little bit more context. But yeah, every time you hear Tina and I say something that is relevant to your specific situation, write it down as an action item for you to further make action on once you are researching your exact county. First thing you're going to want to do is Google the name change and the county you live in, because each county typically has a step-by-step guide and online forms. I highly recommend you use, I shouldn't say recommend, I think it's best to use official government sites rather than using, say, like Google AI or something like that, because Google AI is pulling information from a bunch of different places, and sometimes it could be pulling information from an incorrect source. So if you're using the exact county website, typically they will have the most updated information in terms of forms and steps like that. If you're not using an official government website, make sure it's a reputable source and that it is the most up-to-date format for everything you need to submit it to the courts. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is gather all your documentation that might be required for your name change. So I'm talking like IDs, passport, birth certificates, things like that. I want to note here that sometimes replacing those documents, like birth certificates, can take a really long time just because of the nature of how the government works. So if you're interested in doing a name change and you know that one of those IDs is either missing or needs to be replaced, you should request that as soon as possible. That way you know you're getting started right away. So next, you're going to want to start filling out your petition. This is, I think, the part where most people get scared. They look at the petition, it looks really official and kind of intimidating, and then they kind of back out. I don't want you to get like intimidated by a form. It's literally just a form that we need to fill out as accurately as possible and just go step by step, line by line. So a petition is just a formal application in writing made to a court. And so each county will have a hyper-specific petition format. So that's why I can't give you like exact steps for the petition, because your county is going to be different than the one next to you maybe. So it's really hard to tell. But again, if you Google your specific county and name changes, you should be able to find that information readily available online. And if for whatever reason you get stuck, again, you can hit us up. I'll drop up my email in the chat at the end. Also, the petition is being submitted to the court, so everything must be correct. So I think it's very important that if you can, have like a second or third person review that information just to make sure everything's spelled correctly, especially things like your new name. You'd hate for a spelling error in the petition to end up you having a name that doesn't actually reflect who you are. And again, just to stress, don't let the unfamiliar format intimidate you. Just go line by line. We're just filling out an official form. That's all. And then some people could have slightly more complex cases. And I don't like to use the word complex without kind of giving a little bit of a disclaimer there. It doesn't mean you as a trans person is complex, but more like there are other complex factors in your legal history that might make your case a little bit less straightforward than others. But complex name change cases are not uncommon, and most people are able to complete a complex name change. So we're going to go over some of the ways that a name change could be more complex. And so this is one of those things where if something applies to your situation specifically, write that down as an action item and write down the things I talk about in terms of documentation. If your name change feels maybe not so straightforward and a bit more complex, it might be best to seek legal representation or going through an organization like us. And again, we're not unique, so if you're not in our service areas, there's probably someone doing similar work in your area. So next, we're going to go over preparing your petition. I just want to flag that on the slide, it's just an example of New York's petition. So like I said before, everyone's petitions will be slightly different. They will not all look the same. Most petitions are going to ask for any aliases or misspellings of your current legal name. So say you accidentally got an ID with a nickname or a misspelling of your birth name. Make sure to include that in the aliases because they're going to want to know that information. You're also going to want to list it out completely, like your first, middle, last, and then, first, middle initial, last, and then first and last. Most of the time, you're going to need to give a reason for your name change. With our program, we stick to pretty basic language of I would like my name to be consistent with my identity and appearance, and that tends to be sufficient enough for the courts. If you have any judgments or liens, so that's any like money owed, judgments that have been filed in the courts, you may have to list those. So if you have any judgments or liens, what you're going to want to do is grab any paperwork you have regarding that and make sure that you provide that with the petition if that's required for your county. Same thing with pending legal proceedings, so any lawsuits, whether you're suing or being sued. Again, you're going to want to grab any documentation about the current status of that lawsuit because the courts may require that information as part of your petition. And then also any other part of your criminal history. So say you have any misdemeanors or felonies, you don't have to list violations, convictions only. And then you'll attach a certificate of disposition, is what they call it in New York, but it's just like the documentation saying the current status of the case. And then if you have any pending legal matters that don't have any results yet, there'll often be a separate pending matters paragraph where you'll include that information and again, grab any documentation you have on that pending matter because it may be required for your county. I mentioned the term certificate of disposition. Like I said, that's the term that we use a lot in New York. I'm not sure that your county would use that term, so I just want to clarify that a little bit. If you have ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or felony, they might require this. So it's an official court document that indicates the current status or the final disposition or the final status of the conviction. You can contact the courts where you were sentenced to obtain that document, and they should have record of it if you no longer have that in your possession. And again, like I said, not all courts use that specific term, but what you're looking for is the documents from the courts that say the current status or the final status of your conviction. And then next thing, we're going to continue to talk about possible ways your case might be a little bit more complex. So if you have ever filed bankruptcy, you're going to want to include your discharge of debt. So you'll be given, similar to the paperwork regarding your leave, you'll be given a paperwork that states the status of your bankruptcy, so the court may require that information. Or who people, but someone over 18 must serve as a petitioner. So there's different requirements state by state on who can be the person who represents the child. So you'll definitely want to make sure that if you're representing someone that you fit those requirements, because again, they're different state by state, county by county. And then some places may require consent from a non-petitioning parent. So you'll also want to look up those rules as well. Again, if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed with a minor name change, again, maybe it might be best for you to look for an organization like ours that might be able to grab you some pro bono representation. Same thing with immigration. We all know this administration has been very difficult with immigration. There's no way around it. So if you're seeking to change your name and you are currently not a legal citizen in the United States, know your current status. If you are seeking asylum based on your transgender status, sometimes a name change can be helpful in your case to prove who you are. But states have different requirements for different name changes for different people who are not US citizens. So you just want to really assess the current legal situation, your need for documents, and the risks you want to take. And you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're looping in any immigration attorneys that you're working with into the name change so they're aware of that, because you don't want to make things more complicated for yourself down the line if one court process is going through in another name and another is going through in another. So you'll want to loop in any other legal workers who are working on any other immigration cases. Okay, next, we're going to talk a little bit about some possible county requirements that are not in all places, and you might have just heard of these things. Anecdotally, a lot of these laws have recently changed, especially in some of our service areas. So you might have heard some of these things as the lore of like name change law and how things are outdated. But definitely check because you might be incorrect. You might not have to do some of those outdated laws that everyone always complains about. So things like publications. So in places like New York, you used to have to publish your name change in a circulating newspaper in order to change your name. Now, there are ways to petition that so you don't have to publish, but there are different requirements to have that waiver for non-publishing. But again, that's to make sure that you're always looking things up because we talk to people all the time in our program who still anticipate having to publish in their name change in the newspaper, but that was changed in 2021 for New York. So word hasn't gotten out yet. So make sure you look up if publication is a requirement in your county. Also, some counties have residency requirements. A residency requirement means like you have to live in that county for a specific amount of time before you're eligible for a name change. So some counties used to be like 6 months. So you had to be able to prove that you lived in that county for that amount of time. Even if you moved one county over, you then have to restart the clock with the 6 months, which is a whole barrier on itself. But again, people have been working to remove some of those laws because it's this day and age, moving county to county isn't really that big of a deal. So again, if you've heard of residency requirements as part of your process, make sure to look up and see if that's still a requirement. There are ways for people who are houseless or housing insecure to find ways of meeting those residency requirements, and a lot of those resources for how you can provide proof of residency if you meet that houseless or housing insecure will be listed online as well. But again, if you meet that, you can always reach out to our organization. We can provide some self-help resources as well if we have any for your county. And sometimes address history may just fully be required. So like in Pennsylvania, one of our service areas, it is required that you provide your previous 5 years of residency history, even if that was outside of the state. So those might be requirements. Also, another thing that kind of feels outdated, but some places have is a fingerprint card. So they'll have you go get that like traditional like ink fingerprint card, and the places that I know of, they'll give you back that card because then you're going to submit it with your petition to the courts. So make sure to hold on to those, make sure you don't alter them in any way or, rip the documents or anything like that. And you might be required to submit for fingerprinting. There's a lot of places that it's like, $20. So there is a financial barrier there. But I know in our service area specifically, there are some free resources. Some of the free resources tend to be the police, so you want to be very careful with how you utilize those resources as well. Other things that I talked about before are spousal consent for your name change. Again, I haven't seen this in any of our service areas and it seems pretty outdated for a lot of places, but if you're married, your spouse may require you to give consent that they approve your name change. And then you might have to list any child or spousal support if you are paying those or receiving those. Like I said, consent from a non-petitioning parent if you're submitting for a minor. And then you may be required to provide notice to any creditors, parties of lawsuits, or law enforcement if you have anything open and pending right now. They may require you to just update those people that your name change is granted. So that might be part of your name change as well. So request a seal. This is another law that's changing a lot. So again, make sure that you're up to date on your current law when you're doing your name change. So you can request a seal and your trans status is supposed to be sufficient enough. So what is sealing? This means that you as a petitioner, and if you have like an attorney working with you, will be the only people who have access to the record in theory. And if you seal, it might be a little bit harder for you to obtain certified copies of a name change in the future. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about requesting to seal and when you're getting your certified copies. And then we're going to talk about what is a certified copy before I get too deep into that. So consider those things, that it might be a little bit harder to get your copies, but it might be more private if you seal. Consider your safety risks there. What is a certified copy? This is the document that's issued by the court that officially states that your name change is granted. So this is gonna typically have a wet stamp on it or a raised seal or something like that. And most of the government organizations like DMV, things like that, they're going to require one of those official raised seal or wet stamp documents to update your name, and it will just prove that you've legally changed your name in the courts. One thing that we like to say as a pro tip, if you have the availability, it might be a good idea to make photocopies of that certified copy, because places typically like your cell phone bill, they don't need one of those copies with the official seal because you have to pay for those copies. So you don't want to have to give them to everyone, even people who don't need the paid for copies. So I would say if you can, make a couple handful photocopies of that so you can submit it to the non-official places. Typically with the people that run through our programs, we'll get them 5 copies if it's unsealed, and then 7 to 10 if it's sealed, just because, again, it's a little bit harder, so we want to make sure they have more up front. And then do not remove any staples or receipts or anything like that. And I see a question in the chat, which I have not been following along with, which I should have been. You can get more copies after the fact. You just have to go to the court where you submitted your name change. But like I said, if you seal, it might be a little bit more difficult because only you or the attorney, if you had one, would be able to get those copies. All right. We've talked about all the requirements for your name change, what's the document when you're done with the name change. And so now we got to talk about filing, because we actually have to file the name change. There may be some associated fees, just like I talked about on the last slide, there being some possible fees. In many places, there are waivers that you can submit, that you can petition if you cannot pay for those fees. And again, there'll be different requirements for different counties on what you have to meet in order to meet those filing fee requirements. So what you're going to want to do is, I told you to Google the county that you're doing your name change in and follow the state's website. So you're going to want to follow their step-by-step guide on how to file, because not every state or county is the same. So some states you can e-file, so you can do it online. Other places you actually have to file in the court system. So you're going to want to make sure that you know the proper way to submit your name change once you have finished the petition. And like I said, there are fee waivers for some of the fees as well, if you meet those requirements. So now you filed. You've either e-submitted or you've went down to the courts. What does that mean? So depending on where you live, again, these are laws that are constantly changing, you might be required to have a hearing. So what is a hearing? A hearing would be held in a court in front of a judge. And so they're going to review the petition that you submitted. They might ask some simple clarifying questions, things like that. To keep in mind, a hearing will be held in a public space with other people who have court dates that day. So there will be other people in that setting. So just make sure to prep yourself for that. Best practices is always, dress to impress. You are in a courthouse. Make sure you show up on time to make it through any security, things like that. But again, not all states require hearings. Oop, that was a feather. So make sure that you are aware of what you have to do in terms of next steps once you file, because some courts might not update you when the name change is completed. You might have to reach out to them directly to find out if the name change was granted or if there was additional information needed. And so now we're just going to go over some examples of our service areas and sort of low, medium, high lift, so y'all can kind of put into context some of the things that we've just talked about in terms of possible requirements. So we consider New York City a low lift because of the Gender Recognition Act. Shout out to Charlie Arrowwood and everyone else who worked on the Gender Recognition Act, which made name changes a whole lot more simple in New York City. So we consider that a low lift. We can say Atlanta a medium lift, and then Philadelphia is our heavy lift. Why do we consider New York City lift? Things like no residency requirements. You do have to provide proof of address, but no residency requirements. They got rid of publication. Most people are able to do a name change without a hearing. The processing time has cut down significantly. It used to be several months. Now it can just be several weeks. So there's lots of ways that it's just been improved and made a lot more user friendly. There's definitely other ways to improve, but it's definitely one of our easier places. It's also one of our cheaper service areas, with the filing fee only being $65 and also there being a fee waiver for that. So that's why New York City is considered a low lift for us. Of our service areas, Atlanta is a medium lift just because it's a little bit harder to waive publication. We have not seen a great deal of success with waiving publication in Atlanta, but we have a little bit more success with like leniency with like criminal charges and things like that. We do still have some hearings that we see, so that's why Atlanta is a little bit more of a heavy lift. And then we consider the Philadelphia to be the heaviest lift because a bunch of things. You have to do the fingerprinting. There's a publication requirement. Again, you can possibly have that publication requirement waived. The filing fees are very expensive in Philly, so it's $333.23. Again, we can have filing fees waived for that, but it's still a pretty large barrier. And have been hearings as well. So lots of different complicating factors in Philly. Also things like a felony name change ban. So like some states, if you have felony convictions, there may be additional time after you've completed your sentence that you are unable to change your name. Sometimes it can be up to 10 years. So Pennsylvania has that law. So our organization is actively working to try and get rid of those laws because it seems additionally punitive for trans people. But those are things you might want to look into as well. Okay, so now you filed, the courts have granted your name changes, so you have your certified copies that we talked about. You have the ones with the raised seal, you've made a couple copies of it. Now, unfortunately, there's no like central database where you can go and be like, this is my new name, update everything in my life. So we call it the whack-a-mole process. So unfortunately, every time you see your old name, you just got to contact that organization and provide them with the necessary documentation to update your name. So there's going to be some major buckets like your government documents, things like that. So like Social Security, passport, your DMV records, your birth certificate, those types of things. But then you're also going to need to contact like your bank, your cell phone, if you have a lease in your name, your pharmacy, all those different places. And you're going to have to figure out what level of documentation they require. Can they accept just a photocopy of your certified copy, or or do they need that like official raised seal? So you'll want to make a list of all the different places that your name is and then what type of documentation it is, and then just start providing them with that information. We provide some overarching like documentation federal level support on our website that you can look into as well. And then Tina is going to cover gender markers and federal documents because I know that's been a big thing right now in just a minute. So that's the name change process. Really try not to get overwhelmed. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go through the petition. You're going to want to make sure that you list anything that is relevant to you specifically in your legal situation. Have someone double check your work, and then you're going to want to file your petition in the exact steps that the courts require. And then just make sure to follow up with any next steps that the courts require. If they have a hearing, if they require additional information, or if you just have to follow up with them once the name change is granted to get your documentation. Again, don't let a new process intimidate you. There's places like us where, again, we're not unique. There are tons of organizations like us. Hit us up if you're confused, even if you're not even in our service areas. Like I said, we have a lot of self-help resources. We have a lot of documentation that might be useful to you that we could just forward on. Just know that typically after these webinars, Tina and I get pretty slammed and we're a small team. So it might take us a little bit of time to get back to you, but we do respond to everyone who hits up our email. So next, I'm going to pass it on to Tina for gender marker updates.
Thank you, Casey. So can I just get a thumbs up if everyone can see my screen?
Yep.
Thank you. So like name changes, each state is going to vary heavily with their gender marker change requirements. However, though, unlike name changes, legal gender marker changes are not required for every state. So that means, unlike for name changes, For gender marker changes, you may not need to file that through the court in order to change it on your documents, which will make a lot more sense as we go through this presentation. So I say that because most states, however, do still require some sort of court order or physician's letter or document of the sort in order to certify the gender marker change. And so determining whether you will need to legally change your gender marker will depend on, one, the state you were born in for your birth certificate, and then two, the state in which you legally reside in for your driver's license and ID. So if someone was living in New Jersey but was born in Alabama, those are going to be two separate processes for their New Jersey ID and their Alabama birth certificate. And so similarly for the name change, you'll want to create a to-do list based on your research on your specific state. And you'll want to gather all the necessary documents like current IDs, birth certificates, which you'll most likely already have if you filed a name change. And like Casey mentioned before, make sure to only use government websites when researching your state's requirements. And while the Name Change Project doesn't directly assist with gender marker changes, we recommend that if you are seeking both a name and gender marker change, that you do them simultaneously if that time allows you, as the process and requirements can often overlap. And most importantly, it might also just save you a whole lot of money to make these changes, as there is just various fees that come along with each individual change. And so we'll start off here with just explaining a couple different documents that you might encounter when doing your state's research. You might see affidavit. And so Casey covered what a petition is, right? So that's a formal written request for judicial action, while an affidavit is a formal written statement that serves as an evidence towards a singular side in an argument, right? Or to affirm a claim that someone's making. So affidavits are signed by the person who's making the statement and a notary public. And an affidavit is also a common legal document that you'll find when researching your state's gender marker change requirements. And so, for example, here I've attached Kansas's gender marker change affidavit for correcting a birth record, and this is to be sent to the Kansas Office of Vital Statistics. It's pretty common for an affidavit to be required for amending a birth record. Now, a declaration is, so the difference here between a declaration and an affidavit is that the declaration is only signed by the person making the statement. So a notary is not needed. And so, for example, I've attached Ohio's declaration of gender change for correcting a state ID or driver's license. And this is a common document. This is a common document amongst states that still require a physician to quote unquote certify a gender change. And this particular document is the declaration from Ohio to be signed by the applicant and their physician that they're working with on their gender affirming care and submitted to the applicant's local DMV. And now for the physician's letter. So the requirements for each jurisdiction are going to vary as there are different standards per state. And so the thing you'll want to note here is that the terms appropriate clinical treatment or proof of surgery are going to vary in definitions according to your state. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that once we go state by state on some requirements. So all that to say, researching your state's specific language requirements is crucial. Because sometimes a doctor will call HRT surgery, like that would be sufficient, but some states specifically want proof of an actual surgery, right? So it should be noted that there are just some jurisdictions that also don't allow birth certificate changes at all, and they're being sued. So, it's not good stuff here, but, it is what it is in these particular areas for right now. So we are now going to go on to the gender marker change requirement examples using different A4TE name change project service areas. We're going to go over Illinois, which is going to be our low lift, New York, which is medium lift. That was actually, it used to be switched, the two, and I'll explain why they're switched now. And then Georgia, which is our heavy lift state. And so I want to bring up self-attestation because the way I've organized these low, medium, and high lift requirements is essentially based on self-attestation. So when changing your gender marker, this essentially refers to being able to simply check a box or fill out a form without the need of a physician's letter, aka what should be the requirement everywhere. So for Illinois, this was effective as of July 1st of 2020. Birth certificates are completely self-attestation now. There used to be a declaration or an affidavit, or either a declaration or affidavit. I believe it was a declaration for birth certificate changes in Illinois. But now you can just submit the affidavit and certificate of correction request, and there you can, correct your gender marker there. And Illinois is also great because one is the same requirements for both adults and minors. And so that's also another reason as to why it's low lift, right? Because it's the same across the board, no matter what age you are. And also they allow M, F, and X options for both birth certificates and state IDs and driver's licenses. So here you could just see the requirements here for Illinois. Changing your gender marker on your state ID and license is all self-attestation. Oh yes, and something else I wanted to note here too. Most government websites, they won't blatantly label the process as self-attestation, right? So when researching your state's requirements, just be sure to look very closely to ensure that you're not completing more steps than necessary here. And so now New York is I'll say it's a low medium lift state, right? Simply medium because of the difference in the adults and minors, but pretty low lift because of the Gender Recognition Act that was passed in 2022 that Casey previously mentioned. And so just to give a brief overview again, the Gender Recognition Act was spearheaded by former Name Change Project staff attorney Charlie Arrowood. And this majorly streamlined the name and gender marker change process for New Yorkers. This removed the publication requirement, which I saw some stuff in the chat. It is an insane requirement, and this was taken away due to the Gender Recognition Act. This also added the X gender marker on New York State IDs and birth certificates as well, and also allows people to self-attest for their gender marker change. And so here we're looking at self-attestation for both birth certificates and state ID changes, and the processes are going to be different for adults and minors here. So you're definitely going to want to look at that, and this slide deck will be sent over within the week or so. So if New York is your state and you want to follow these instructions, just be sure that you're following the correct ones, or for whatever particular state you're in. And also it should be noted here too for New York that you can also do this change online. So you can also check to see if that can be done online in your particular state. Okay, and now for Georgia is our heavy lift state because there is a 0 self-attestation there. Georgia has pretty strict and pretty awful statute about requirements for gender marker changes, just being straight up. As stated in the slide, in order to change your gender marker on state documents, the individual must have had some sort of surgical procedure towards, they quote, changing your sex with a court order or physician's letter to prove it. And then for birth certificates, you must have had a legal name change. And so I want to unpack that because that's a lot of really jarring, scary information. So since Georgia doesn't have official affidavits or declarations for a gender marker change, meaning that they're intentionally making it hard, you'll really want to have a conversation with your physician, one, to gain their perspective on what, treatment here moving forward looks like for you as an individual, and if this ends up getting complicated or the doctor that you're working with isn't as informed or as helpful as we need them to be, it's probably best to consult with a Georgia attorney that has experience with this, right? It would probably be, and like I said, we are not giving legal advice here, but just given the very heavy requirements in Georgia, I think getting some sort of legal representation or some sort of legal advice would definitely be advisable for your particular situation. And in regards to the name change requirement, that's also to say, that's also assuming that people want both name and gender marker change requirements too, right? So, if you're finding that you're in that situation as well, definitely best to consult with an attorney. And so if you live in either Georgia or a state with similar restrictions, this lack of self-attestation definitely makes this process a little bit more stressful and overwhelming. And just please remember that there are organizations and individuals that want to help you with this. There are experts, there are people who want to share their expertise. And so definitely please reach out to those people because it's not easy. It's a lot. So definitely source out your resources locally as best as you can. All right, and so now we're just going to get into some more larger topics with passports and Social Security, as we have had to make some pretty major updates to this section for pretty obvious reasons since the new presidential administration. So to put it point blank, the passport and Social Security agencies have essentially stopped issuing gender marker changes pretty much ever since an executive order was issued on January 20th of 2025. And prior to this executive order, people changing their passports were able to change their sex designation to MF or even X. And then even prior to this executive order for Social Security, folks were able to change their gender marker to either M or F. They had not added the X option yet, but for obvious reasons, obviously that is not the case anymore. And so A4TE actually put out a couple or three different documents, which I'm going to share with you. It's the Know Your Rights series. So there's one for passports and then one for Social Security. It's extremely, extremely useful information that's been updated pretty recently. So you can read all about the executive orders and what they're doing there. And I see there's some questions, and if you could just hold them off till the end of the Q&A, I'll be happy to try to answer those. I know that probably people have a lot of questions and concerns right now. And then in regards to Orr v. Trump, so to give it's a pretty large case here. I have a lot of actually pretty in real time updates as we just received some updates on the case this evening. So essentially, the ACLU filed a federal lawsuit challenging the State Department's refusal to issue passports with accurate sex designations on behalf of 6 trans, non-binary, and intersex plaintiffs. And so the most recent update here is that the district court issued a preliminary injunction to those 6 named plaintiffs. So that meant that the State Department actually did end up issuing them their updated passports reflecting their gender identities. And as of yesterday, we were still awaiting a court's ruling to essentially extend that preliminary injunction to a larger class of people who have also been affected by this horribly transphobic change, right? So the argument to extend that was in late May. And so actually, just this evening on the 17th, a district court said that there could be a class-wide preliminary injunction, which means could be, so no decisions there yet. So that means generally a preliminary injunction for people who aren't bringing the lawsuit. So essentially they classified it as 2 different people. And this is just paraphrasing, and I'll link also to this most recent update in the chat. First class of people, to paraphrase, would be trans people who have gotten an M or F marker, but for the Department of State prohibition and Trump ban. Sorry, I'm reading from the updates because they just happened. And then the second class would be, again, to paraphrase, trans and non-binary people who would have gotten X gender marker here. So I think the biggest takeaway here, right, is that folks who have been affected by this executive order should really try to stay tuned for more information from sources like ACLU, A4TE, or other trusted sources, as there are constantly new updates, new developments, people who are fighting and challenging this stuff. Yeah, so that's the update there. And all right, and then now just moving on, we're reaching the end here, so we'll be able to answer some questions in just a moment. I just wanted to highlight also our Know Your Rights Trans Legal Survival Guide, because under pages 15 to 17, you can find some resources for other organizations, perhaps in your area, that could offer name and gender marker change assistance if we're not able to assist you. So that could be found on pages 15 to 17, and just note too, This guide is from November 2024, so there will be some updated info, but most of those resources at the end should be all up to date for the most part. And then just a couple other resources that are always helpful for myself outside of A4TE. We have the Movement Advancement Project, or MAP, which provides an overview of state laws and policies governing name and gender marker changes. And this will also lay out which states have an X gender marker option. And then I also wanted to highlight Trans Lifeline's name change guide for people with criminal records. And this guide was created by Trans Lifeline Microgrants, and it briefly overviews the restrictions in each state on name changes for folks who are currently incarcerated and or have a criminal record. So that is all the information that we have for you today in regards to name and gender marker changes. It's a lot of stuff. I hope you were able to gain a lot of good information, and we hope to, be able to clarify some things and answer a couple questions what we can. And if you have any sort of, like I said, we're not able to give legal advice, but Casey just dropped the email. If you have any sort of other requests, like additional resources for your state, things like that, feel free to shoot us an email and someone from our team will get back to you at our earliest convenience. We're a really small team that deals with a lot of stuff it deals with a lot of stuff at the same time, but we will definitely try to get back to you as soon as possible. So yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Casey, and thank you so much, Tina, for your knowledge and expertise. We have a couple of questions, and I just want to preface for folks who were submitting them. If they're very hyper-specific, which I do notice that there are some, we won't be able to answer them because it may be on the seeking legal advice type of direction. So I would highly recommend reaching out to the ncp at transequality.org email, which we will be sending out also in an email as well, so that if they're able to answer those more in-depth questions, they'll be able to take their time to do that. And if not, they'll be able to direct you to the person who would be able to do that for you. So just wanted to give that preface first, that we won't be able to answer everything here. But to tackle the first question, this is off topic, but related to signing up for appointments for Plume. Yes, you can sign up with your chosen name. You will be using your legal name when you are obtaining your prescriptions from a pharmacy, or if you're using your insurance, but you can use your chosen name for appointments with us. There's a question on, is there a way to change my Pennsylvania birth certificate with my current name and X gender marker? And any thoughts on when Social Security will allow a non-binary gender marker? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You can update your gender marker in PA. Just make sure you take into consideration your risks associated with that, with, again, the current administration and travel internationally. So just make sure to consider that if you do choose X. And then, unfortunately, I don't know about Social Security.
Has there been a successful legal challenge to Trump's executive orders, read truth and gender executive order for any federal documents, which we did just get news today. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the news we got today is encouraging. So, I mean, we got to take the little wins where we can. So I'm going to celebrate this one.
Yes. To finally change my name, where is the very first place I need to go to ask a person that I want to change my name? I'm getting the idea that this is settled in a courtroom.
Yep, exactly. The first thing you're going to want to do, very first thing, is look up the petition format in your county. Once you know the petition format, you can submit that however the courts see fit, whether that's handing it in person or whether that's e-filing. That will all be noted on the website that probably will also store the petition format as well. And again, if you get stuck or nervous, hit us up. We can point you in the right direction.
To clarify, if I live in Maine and was born in Massachusetts and want to change my name, can I still go through my current local court where I live in Maine?
Yeah, also, I was born in Massachusetts too. Go us. When you change your name, that's county by county where you currently live. So when you go to file for the court proceedings, you're going to do that in the county that you live. Once you change your name in the county you live, you'll get that certified copy. Then you take that to Massachusetts, where you'll provide them the certified copy, fill out the necessary documentation, and then they can update your records from there.
Very helpful. Thank you. How would it be possible to make a name change if the state we live in has banned the name change and gender marker process? How do non-binary people deal with the process if the state does not recognize X gender but still identify as trans femme/trans masc?
Yeah, so places where there's like full blocks right now, like we're seeing a lot of nonsense in Texas and things like that. Everywhere there is nonsense, someone is suing. There's lots of places like us. You have like Lambda Legal, you have the ACLU. There's so many different organizations that are working, in different sections to make sure every single area is getting covered. But again, lawsuits take a long time. Appeals to this stuff does take a lot of time. And unfortunately, we live in a world where some of us can't have documentation that represents who we are. So a lot of states don't offer X gender marker, and that can be really hard for people because like you're having to make a choice that isn't like that's not you, like that, and then you have to live with that choice. So if you are in one of those states, I would suggest if you would rather have an X gender marker, see if there's any organizations on the ground working to get legislative change, because maybe you could be a part of something bigger like that, even if it's just maybe like a testimonial or something like that. There's so many different ways that you could get involved. Again, that's not the ideal. Like, I would really just love for us all to have X if we wanted it, but sometimes we have to do a little bit extra work right now. And I know that's a big ask for trans people.
So thank you. Is it possible to remove a middle name? Many of us may have a middle name that is inconsistent with our identity and appearance, and some of us don't want to have that.
Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely get rid of your middle name. You can also, if you want to keep your first name and maybe just change up your last name or just straight up change your middle name, you can do really any different variation that you want. Another question we get all the time is, can I go with a single name? So can I get rid of my middle name and my last name? Technically, yes. In the courts, yes. But think about that in practice, right? So like most forms, including the ones that apply for our own program, requires a first and a last name. So by going with a mono name, essentially you might be making your default last name like NA or like not available or something like that, because every form is going to require that. So just take that into consideration if you want to go down to just one name. It might be a larger lift logistically long term, but I'm not here to convince you of one thing or the other. But you can do all different types of variations to your name change.
Awesome. This person says they're a US citizen, a PA resident studying in Canada and hoping to stay there when they graduate next year. Is there any possibility they'd be able to change their name and gender marker in the US while still studying in Canada?
I am really not great, and our program is not great with international name changes. That's where I get really nervous. But we do have a connection in our program to people who do name changes in Canada specifically. So if this person wants to email us, I can connect you to those organizations doing the work on the ground since we have direct relationships.
Sweet, thank you. For clarity, in the state of Georgia, physical surgery is required, such as breast augmentation or SRS. HRT is not acceptable.
Sorry, what was the last part of that? You cut out.
For clarity, in the state of Georgia, physical surgery is required and HRT only is not accepted. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct, unfortunately. Yes, that is specifically for Georgia. I think some other states, there is kind of some leeway there. So that's why we sort of advise you to have a conversation with both your physician and potentially a local legal organization as well. But yes, that for Georgia, it is specifically surgery, unfortunately.
For sure. This one says, also in Georgia, do you need consent from a parent even if you're over 18?
If you're over 18, you're over 18. You're an independent adult unless there's some other like complicating legal factors like guardianship things, or, you otherwise don't have the legal authority over your own self. But if you have full legal authority over yourself at 18, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I'll ask a question that will encompass a couple. Are there any issues with having a state license that has your preferred name in your passport having your dead name?
This is another situation where it's like we might have to live in uncomfortable times. Lambda Legal did a really good webinar right when all of the Trump executive orders were happening with around passports and IDs and whatnot. So if you're traveling, it might be a good idea to listen to that webinar because it's attorneys answering specific legal questions about mismatched documents, how to travel like that, and some of the implications of traveling with mismatched documents. So you can have mismatched documents. I mean, I personally have mismatched documents. Is it ideal? No. But in the up until maybe we don't know, we're still in kind of a gray area. If you're not going to need a passport in the immediate future, but you want to do a name change, maybe you don't update your passport and you just update your driver's license because that's all you need for travel right now, for your type of travel, not all travel. Then maybe you don't do your passport. That way you don't end up with a passport with a wrong gender marker on it. Maybe if you can delay that a little bit, maybe the ACLU's case would have made more progress or, something like that. And then you might not have to get stuck with a gender marker that's not the one you want. So this is really unfortunately a time where you're going to have to assess your risk and how you're going to use your documents right now and kind of, yeah, see what best fits your needs. I know that's not a great answer. Again, if you have specific questions about travel, hit us up. We can kind of give you a more specific answer. But again, I hate to be doing this webinar being like, unfortunately, we're in an uncomfortable situation where you might have to have some mismatched documents if that's what your needs require.
That makes sense. Thank you. When this person was asking about how do these service areas work for A for TE, do you just come into the service areas and get help with the process?
Cool. Yeah. So when we're open, we have an intake form. So as long you always have to change your name in the county you reside. So if you reside in any of the service areas that we currently offer, all you would have to do is go to our website and apply for via the intake form. But unfortunately, we're closed right now, and everything is done digitally once we are open. So, like, we'll do an intake call via the phone. We'll gather all of your information and vet everything we need via email. If you are in our service areas, some of them we have a little bit of bandwidth to accept cases. So, if you are in our service areas and you're listening in, definitely email us. There is tiny, tiny bit of wiggle room to get some people in.
Cool. How does this all affect the real ID?
Yeah, this is a big one. So this is where you have to risk assess, right? So if they're going to be requiring us to use real IDs and we can't just update our regular driver's license and it's either get a real ID or get a passport, that all has implications on things. So again, you really need to assess your need for the type of ID you need right now. So like just to give you my own personal example, because of how my documentation is set up, I personally am not going to get a real ID. I am only going to stick with my passport moving forward. Again, that's a personal choice I've made because of my mismatched documents. That's a risk y'all will have to assess for yourself. Yeah. Because of the height, because the real ID requires additional documentation. So like if all of your documentation doesn't say the correct gender marker, which mine does not, they're going to look at all of that and I might end up with a real ID that doesn't have the gender marker I want. So my passport has the gender marker I want, so I'm going to stick with that for my situation right now.
That makes sense. This person says, I'm planning on moving into a different state within the next couple of months from Texas to Oregon, was born in Tennessee. Is it better to work on a name/gender marker change before or after the move?
It all depends on timing, depends on, how long you have. Some courts are really quick. Like New York, sometimes some name changes are getting approved within 2 weeks. So like you might have enough wiggle room there. Texas is not the greatest landscape right now. So I would plan for a little bit longer. So like if someone was applying and I would say give it more than a couple months maybe. So it might be a good idea to Just verify how long people are seeing name changes take in your current state. If that fits, maybe go for it. Or another alternative is just start doing the research for your new home state and then prep your petition and everything for your new home state. That way, the moment you have a proof of address, you're ready to go. You can submit that to the new state, and there's really no delay once you move. So either way, you could be making progress.
For sure. We had a question about what do we do with the petition for a name change after we fill it out, but we already answered that, and it's very state specific. Is that
Yep, just
about
follow
right?
your state's petition filing guidelines.
Yeah. This person asked, why are hearings a requirement? So
Yeah.
the crowd just object to the name change? Question mark.
Yeah, hearings, I get it, but I don't get it. Like the thought process is like the judge is verifying like that the information that you're providing is true, which is supposed to be the case, like when you submit the petition. So like that's why some states now just approve your petition on paper and don't actually ask you to come for a hearing. So like that's a lot of the time in New York, you don't have to have a hearing. But sometimes people with like maybe a more, again, like complex legal history where there might be some additional factors that the judge needs to take into consideration. Maybe the judge wants to speak to the person about those prior criminal charges or just might need additional information. So that could be a reason for a hearing. And then some states just require them because that's just part of the law. So yeah, all different reasons. And it's kind of, again, county by county, state by state.
Sweet. Thank you. I was born in California, but live in NC, North Carolina. What would it look like to update my sex on my birth certificate?
Birth certificate. So you're going to want to go through California. So you're going to want to follow California's state laws in order to update your birth certificate. If you want to do your gender marker and your name change at the same time, what you would want to do is if you currently live in North Carolina, you'll want to follow North Carolina's name change laws, get your certified copy, and then you'll provide that certified copy to the state of California to update your name at the same time as meeting whatever requirements California has for updating your gender marker. You don't have to do those things at the same time, but we just say like, if you can hold off, again, this is everyone's own risk assessment. If you can hold off on updating your gender marker till your name change is done, maybe then you don't have to pay for two IDs, and everything. Costs start to add up pretty quickly. So if you can do it all at the same time and save yourself buying multiple IDs, that might be best.
Cool. That 1 out of 2 questions left. I only have a driver's permit. I'd still have to submit that as a document to be changed in my position. Is that correct?
That might be able to be used as proof of identification. I think I'm understanding the question where you might be able to use that as proof of identification to submit that to the courts. But then another way that question I think could be asked is you do need to update your driver's permit or whatever temporary ID this is with your new name if you're going to continue to use that ID. Yeah, because I think that question could be answered two ways.
For sure. And last one. So regarding the real ID, does the executive order prohibit getting a real ID with a correct gender marker, even if your state allows you to change it?
Well, see, that's the complicated factor. Like, we just don't know. Like, if you have mismatched documents, we just don't know what's going to come back. But again, it's case by case. Like, if you've never had a real ID before and all your documentation lines up, like they're all the right name, they're all the right gender marker, I think you might have a good chance. But again, we are literally actively collecting data from people who are applying for these things right now and seeing what comes out. And everything is just so case by case. So, if like I said, if you're all your document matches, you might get the proper gender marker back. But if you have one document that might be out of line, they might revert to that one. The government is currently asking for the earliest record of birth is the term we've been hearing a lot for your gender markers. So typically the earliest record of birth would be the birth certificate. So they're using that to figure out what your gender marker is. And in some places, even if you update your gender marker, there might still be a record of your original gender marker. So again, even if your documents all line up, there still might be some weird chances that records have been kept and you might not get the desired gender marker.
For sure. Very complicated.
I know. That's why it's like, if you have questions like this, like really assess your own situation, email us or email someone like us doing the work just to like run your ideas by.
Yeah, and I just sent y'all's email address into the chat again as well. I'll send this also to you all via email when I edit the video and we send out the recording. But I just want to give a huge just shout out and thank you to Casey and Tina from A4TE. Like the work that y'all are doing and the constant shifts and changes is, I can't even imagine just how much stress and tension that causes of the constant changes that you have to face and while providing resources for queer and trans folks. So just like thank you, like huge shout out to like the work that y'all do. And also would love to hear a little bit more about like how can folks get in contact with you, like the work that y'all are doing to support other folks that you want to let people know.
Yeah. So really questions, concerns, worries, email us. We'll try and get back to you with whatever resources we can. And then other ways, like our organizing department is now doing like all different types of cool webinars, like how to testify and things like that. And there's also like volunteer days of action now that we have an organizing and a policy department. So there's tons of ways that if you like want to volunteer or just learn new skills that both of our organizations didn't have the bandwidth to do before, so that's really exciting. And then there's also other different like in-person volunteer events for like when we have like our main galas and all that stuff. But yeah, different ways that you can get involved. Check us out because we offer like a wide range of assistance. Like I said, if you need a name change, if you need help with a denial letter for your insurance, if you have questions about how to approach your local government with some trans issues, like now that we've merged, we're really a wraparound service. So we're here.
Beautiful, thank you. And Tina just put in the chat, which I'll put into everyone, just the updates that happened literally today about passports.